Dolly Parton defends shop owner attacked by thugs, changes everything. The small diner was the kind of place that oozed comfort. The warm scent of coffee and freshly baked biscuits mingled in the air, and the faint hum of an old jukebox in the corner filled the room with a nostalgic melody. Behind the counter, Mrs. Jean, a gray-haired woman with a kind smile and years of wisdom etched into her face, bustled about, wiping the countertop and chatting with the regulars. The diner had been her life's work, a place of warmth and familiarity in a town that had seen better days. The bell above the door jingled, announcing the arrival of new customers. But instead of the usual friendly faces, 3 men in leather jackets strode in, their heavy boots clunking against the tiled floor. They didn't belong here. Their presence was an unwelcome intrusion, sending a ripple of unease through the cozy diner. One of them, tall, broad-shouldered, and sporting a thick beard, took off his sunglasses and scanned the room with an intimidating glare. "Afternoon, folks," he said, his voice low and gravelly. He sauntered toward the counter, his 2 companions flanking him like enforcers. "Nice little place you got here." Mrs. Jean straightened, her smile faltering slightly as she glanced at the men. "Afternoon," she said politely, though her voice carried a hint of caution. "Can I get you boys anything? Coffee? Pie?" The leader smirked, leaning on the counter and crossing his arms. "We're not here for coffee," he said, his tone dripping with menace. "We're here to talk business." The other customers exchanged nervous glances, some sinking lower in their seats as the tension in the room thickened. A man in a corner booth whispered something to his wife, who nodded and began gathering her belongings. It was clear that no one wanted to be caught in whatever was about to unfold. "Business?" Mrs. Jean repeated, her brow furrowing. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, come on now, Jean," the man said, his smirk widening. "Don't play dumb. You know how things work around here. A little protection goes a long way." Mrs. Jean's expression hardened, and she straightened her shoulders. "This is a respectable business," she said firmly. "I don't need any protection." The man's smirk vanished, replaced by a cold, menacing glare. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried across the silent diner. "You don't want to make this difficult?" Mrs. Jean didn't flinch. "I said no," she repeated, her voice steady despite the fear flickering in her eyes. The man straightened, letting out a low chuckle as he glanced at his companions. "You hear that, boys?" he said. She said no. "Guess we'll have to convince her." He reached across the counter, knocking over a display of sugar packets and napkins as he grabbed a glass and slammed it onto the floor. The shattering sound echoed through the diner, making everyone jump. "That was just a warning," he said, his voice icy. "Next time, it won't be the glass." "Hey!" a voice called from the back of the diner. "What do you think you're doing?" All heads turned toward the source of the voice. There, standing near a booth, was a woman who needed no introduction. Clad in a pink outfit that managed to be both elegant and practical, with her signature blonde hair perfectly styled, Dolly Parton stepped forward, her eyes blazing with determination. The thugs turned to face her, their expressions shifting from surprise to amusement. "Well, look who it is," the leader said, his smirk returning. "The Queen of Country herself." "What's the matter, Dolly? You lost on your way to the Grand Ole Opry?" Dolly didn't miss a beat. "What's the matter?" she shot back, her southern drawl sharp and unwavering. "You boys forget your manners. Didn't your mamas teach you not to mess with a lady?" The man's smirk faltered, and he narrowed his eyes. "This ain't none of your business," he said. "Why don't you take your pretty little self out of here before things get ugly?" Dolly crossed her arms, planting her feet firmly as she stared him down. "Well now, that's where you're wrong," she said. "When you mess with Mrs. Jean, you're messing with me. And I don't take kindly to bullies." The room fell silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The other customers sat frozen in their seats, their eyes darting between Dolly and the thugs as they braced for what was to come. The leader stepped closer, towering over Dolly, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said. "But guts won't save you." Dolly didn't flinch. "Maybe not," she said. "But I'm not the one who needs saving." The man's jaw tightened, and he glanced at his companions, who shifted uneasily. "Get her out of here." he said, his voice low and dangerous. One of the men stepped forward, reaching for Dolly's arm. But before he could touch her, she grabbed a fork from a nearby table and held it up, the sharp prongs glinting in the light. "Try it," she said, her voice steady as steel. "I dare you." The thug hesitated, his hand hovering in midair as he stared at the fork. The leader let out a low growl, clearly frustrated by the unexpected resistance. "Fine," he said, turning back to Mrs. Jean. "If you won't listen to reason, maybe you'll listen to this?" He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small pistol and slamming it onto the counter. The sight of the weapon sent a collective gasp through the diner, and several customers ducked lower in their seats. "Now," the man said, his voice dripping with menace, "are we gonna have a problem?" Dolly's eyes flicked to the gun, then back to the man. Her expression didn't waver, but there was a new intensity in her gaze, a fire that made even the boldest of men think twice. "Last chance," the man said, his grip tightening on the pistol. "Walk away or what?" Dolly interrupted, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You think waving a gun around makes you a man? Honey, it just makes you look scared." The man's face twisted in anger, and he raised the gun slightly, pointing it at Dolly. But before he could say another word, the sound of police sirens pierced the air, growing louder as they approached the diner. The thugs exchanged panicked glances, their bravado faltering as the reality of the situation set in. "Who called the cops?" the leader demanded, his voice rising. Dolly smiled, a glint of triumph in her eyes. "Looks like your business meeting just got cut short." The sirens grew louder, and the tension reached a fever pitch as the thugs realized their window of escape was rapidly closing. But they weren't done yet, not by a long shot. The air inside the diner was electric, charged with a dangerous mix of fear and defiance. The sirens outside grew louder, but the thugs didn't flinch, at least not visibly. Their leader, still clutching the pistol, let out a sharp, bitter laugh, his eyes narrowing as he turned back to Dolly. "You think those cops are going to stop me?" he sneered. "You think they're on your side?" Dolly raised an eyebrow, her hand still gripping the fork she'd picked up earlier. Her expression was calm, almost amused, but there was steel in her gaze, a quiet but unshakable determination. "Honey," she drawled, "I don't need them to be on my side. I just need them to see what you're doing." The leader's jaw tightened, and he slammed the pistol down on the counter again, making the coffee cups rattle. "Shut up," he barked. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Dolly didn't even blink. "You're right," she said. "I don't. But you clearly don't know who you're dealing with either." The other two thugs exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence starting to waver. One of them, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, leaned in toward the leader. "Boss," he muttered, his voice low, "maybe we should get out of here. This is getting too hot." The leader rounded on him, his face twisted in anger. "We're not leaving until we get what we came for," he snapped. "If you've got a problem with that, then maybe you're in the wrong line of work." The scarred man flinched, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stepped back, his eyes darting nervously toward the windows as the sirens grew louder. The third thug, a hulking brute who looked like he could bench press the counter, cracked his knuckles and stepped forward, positioning himself between Dolly and the leader. "You talk too much," the brute said, his voice low and menacing. "Why don't you sit down and let the grown-ups handle this?" Dolly smiled sweetly, but there was nothing soft about the look in her eyes. "And why don't you try saying that to my face without all that false bravado?" she shot back. "I've handled bigger men than you before breakfast." The brute scowled, his massive fists clenching at his sides. "You're pushing your luck, lady," he growled. "You don't know what I'm capable of." "And you don't know what I'm capable of," Dolly replied, her voice calm but firm. "Now, unless you want to find out the hard way, I suggest you and your friends take your business elsewhere." The leader stepped forward again, cutting off the brute before he could respond. "Enough of this," he snarled, grabbing the pistol and pointing it at Mrs. Jean. The old woman gasped, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the counter for support. "You're going to give us what we came for," the leader said, his voice dangerously low, "or we're going to start breaking things. And I don't mean just the dishes." The tension in the diner reached a fever pitch. The customers who hadn't already fled were now frozen in their seats, their eyes wide with fear. The sound of the sirens outside was deafening now, but the police still hadn't arrived, and it was clear the thugs were running out of patience. Dolly took a step forward, putting herself between the leader and Mrs. Jean. "You point that gun at her again," she said, her voice cold as ice, "and you'll regret it." The leader sneered, clearly unimpressed. "Oh yeah," he said. "And what are you going to do about it?" Dolly didn't answer. She just stared him down, her gaze steady and unyielding. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a moment, it seemed like the entire diner was holding its breath. The leader's smirk faltered, just for a second, but then he straightened and let out another sharp laugh. "You're crazy," he said. "You know that? You think you can scare me?" "I don't need to scare you," Dolly replied. "You're already scared. That's why you're waving that gun around like a child throwing a tantrum." The brute stepped forward again, clearly fed up with the back and forth. "Boss, let me handle her," he said, cracking his knuckles again. "She's all talk." The leader hesitated, his grip tightening on the pistol as he glanced between Dolly and the brute. "Fine," he said finally. "But don't hurt her." "Not yet." The brute grinned, stepping closer to Dolly. "You've got a big mouth for such a little lady," he said. "Let's see if you can back it up." Dolly didn't flinch. She didn't even move. She just stood there, her eyes locked on the brute as he loomed over her. "You might want to think twice about that," she said, her voice calm but edged with warning. "Because if you lay a hand on me, you'll wish you hadn't." The brute chuckled, clearly unconvinced. "Yeah," he said. "And why is that?" Before Dolly could respond, the door to the diner burst open, and two uniformed police officers stormed in, their guns drawn. "Everyone freeze," one of them shouted. The thugs spun around, their faces a mix of shock and anger. The leader cursed under his breath, his grip tightening on the pistol as he glared at the officers. "Took you long enough," he muttered. "Drop the weapon," the officer commanded, his voice firm and authoritative. "Now." The leader hesitated, his eyes darting between the officers and the door. It was clear he was considering his options, and none of them were good. Meanwhile, Dolly took a step back, her gaze never leaving the thugs. She knew the situation was far from over. The leader might have been cornered, but he wasn't the type to go down without a fight. And sure enough, he suddenly raised the pistol, pointing it not at the officers but at the ceiling. He fired a single shot, the deafening crack echoing through the diner and sending everyone ducking for cover. "This isn't over," he shouted, his voice wild and desperate. "Nobody moves, or the next one goes into someone's head." The officers froze, their guns still trained on the thugs, but it was clear the situation had just gone from bad to worse. The leader was unhinged now, and the tension in the room was unbearable. Dolly, however, remained calm. Her eyes flicked to Mrs. Jean, who was crouched behind the counter, trembling but unharmed. Then she turned her attention back to the thugs, her mind racing as she considered her next move. The situation was spiraling out of control, and the stakes had never been higher. But if there was one thing Dolly Parton knew how to do, it was rise to the occasion. The single gunshot reverberated through the small diner, a sharp, deafening crack that left the room in stunned silence. The faint tinkling of the shattered light fixture the bullet had hit echoed faintly, as if punctuating the chaos. Several customers cowered under tables, hands covering their heads, while others pressed themselves against the walls, too scared to even breathe. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, and all eyes were on the thug holding the gun. The leader sneered, his hands steady as he aimed the smoking barrel at the ceiling, clearly relishing the fear he was causing. "Now, let me make something crystal clear," he snarled, his voice dripping with menace. "Nobody moves, nobody talks, and nobody tries to play hero. Got it?" The police officers froze, their weapons still drawn but their movements cautious. One of them, a young officer with a shaky grip on his gun, looked to his partner for guidance. The older officer, his face lined with years of experience, held his position, his sharp eyes never leaving the armed thug. "Drop the weapon," the older officer commanded again, his voice calm but firm. "You're only making things worse for yourself." The leader barked out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You think I care about making it worse? You don't get it, do you? I'm already past that point. Dolly stood a few feet away, her pink outfit a stark contrast to the grim scene unfolding around her. Despite the gunshot, despite the danger, she hadn't moved an inch. Her hands were still at her sides, her posture relaxed but alert. Her eyes, however, were locked onto the leader with an intensity that could stop a freight train. "Listen to me, son," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You're scared. I can see it. You don't have to keep doing this." The leader turned to her, his sneer widening. "Scared?" he repeated mockingly. "Of what? You?" He gestured at her with the gun, the movement jerky and wild. "You think you can sweet-talk your way out of this, Dolly? Newsflash, this ain't a country song." "I don't need to sweet-talk you," Dolly replied evenly. "I just need you to think. Look around you. Do you really think this ends well for you?" Her words hit a nerve, and for a moment, a flicker of doubt crossed the leader's face. But he quickly masked it with anger, turning his attention back to the officers. "I said nobody moves," he shouted, "or the next one won't miss." The brute, standing a few feet behind him, shifted uneasily. His earlier bravado was fading, replaced by a growing sense of discomfort. "Boss," he muttered, his voice low, "maybe we should—" "Shut up," the leader snapped, rounding on him with a glare. "I'm handling this." The brute flinched but didn't argue. The scarred man, meanwhile, edged closer to the door, his eyes darting nervously between the police and the customers. He looked like a man searching for an escape route, his loyalty to the leader clearly wavering. Dolly noticed the subtle shift in dynamics, and her sharp mind quickly began to piece together a plan. She couldn't overpower them, at least, not physically, but she didn't need to. Words were her weapon, and she knew how to use them. "You know," she said, her tone conversational but laced with steel, "you might have gotten away with this in some other town. But not here. Not in Mrs. Jean's diner." The leader turned back to her, his sneer returning. "And why is that?" "Because this place isn't just a diner," Dolly said, her voice rising slightly. "It's a community. It's where people come together. And when you mess with a place like this, you're not just messing with one person, you're messing with all of us." The leader snorted, clearly unimpressed. "Spare me the speech," he said. "This isn't some feel-good movie where everyone joins hands and sings Kumbaya." "You're right," Dolly said. "It's not. It's real life. And in real life, people like you don't win." The crowd, still cowering in fear, began to stir slightly. A man near the back of the room, his hands still raised, glanced at Dolly with a flicker of hope in his eyes. A young woman behind the counter whispered something to Mrs. Jean, who nodded subtly and began edging toward the phone on the wall. The leader didn't notice. His attention was fully on Dolly now, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer to her. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you've got me figured out?" Dolly tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "I think you're scared," she said again. "And I think deep down you know you've already lost." The leader's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it looked like he might lash out. But before he could make a move, the sound of shuffling feet drew his attention. He spun around just in time to see Mrs. Jean reaching for the phone, her hand hovering inches away from the receiver. "Don't even think about it," he barked, leveling the gun at her. Mrs. Jean froze, her face pale but defiant. Dolly stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Leave her alone," she said sharply. "Your problem is with me, not her." The leader hesitated, his grip on the gun tightening. The brute and the scarred man exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence now fully replaced by doubt. Outside, the sirens grew louder, and the flashing lights of additional police cars lit up the windows. The older officer took a cautious step forward, his voice calm but firm. "Put the gun down," he said. "This is your last chance." The leader's breathing quickened, his eyes darting wildly as he calculated his next move. He was cornered and he knew it. But instead of surrendering, he raised the gun again, this time aiming it directly at Dolly. The crowd gasped, and the officers shouted in unison, "Drop the weapon." Dolly didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her eyes locked onto the leader's. "You don't want to do this," she said, her voice steady. "Think about your mama. What would she say if she saw you like this? The leader faltered, his hand shaking slightly as her words hit home. For the first time, he looked uncertain, his bravado cracking under the weight of her steady gaze. You've got a choice, Dolly continued. Right here, right now. You can put that gun down and walk out of here with whatever dignity you've got left. Or you can throw it all away. The room fell silent again, the tension unbearable as everyone waited to see what the leader would do. His finger hovered over the trigger, his face a mask of anger, fear, and desperation. And then, finally, he spoke. This isn't over, he muttered, his voice low and shaky. But as he said the words, it was clear to everyone, including himself, that he was wrong. The diner was frozen in a state of unbearable tension. The leader's words, "This isn't over," hung in the air like a challenge, his shaking hands still gripping the pistol. Dolly didn't move, her sharp eyes fixed on him like a predator waiting for its prey to make a mistake. The room felt like it was holding its collective breath, every sound, every creak of a chair, every quiet murmur from the gathered crowd, amplified against the silence. The police officers didn't lower their weapons, but it was clear they were waiting for the right moment to act. The older officer took a step closer, his voice calm but firm. "Put it down," he said, his tone carrying a mixture of authority and warning. "You're out of options." But the leader wasn't ready to give up. "Shut up," he barked, his voice cracking under the weight of his panic. He turned the gun toward the officer, his movements wild and unsteady. "You don't tell me what to do, boss," the scarred thug muttered, inching backward toward the door. "This is getting out of control." "You think I don't know that?" the leader snapped, his glare cutting toward his accomplice. "We're not walking away from this empty-handed. I don't care how many cops they bring." The scarred man hesitated, his loyalty visibly wavering. His eyes darted toward the windows, where flashing blue and red lights from the patrol cars outside painted the walls of the diner. The brute, however, wasn't budging. He crossed his arms and stepped closer to his boss, his expression grim but resolute. "Let's just finish this," the brute growled, his deep voice rumbling through the room. "They're not gonna shoot us if we've got leverage." "Leverage?" Dolly repeated, her voice cutting through the tension. She raised an eyebrow, her tone deceptively casual. "And what exactly do you think you're leveraging, sugar? A bunch of scared folks who just came here for pie and coffee?" The leader turned back to her, his sneer returning, though it was weaker now, more forced. "Don't push me, Dolly," he said. "I don't care who you are." "Clearly you don't," Dolly replied evenly. "Because if you did, you'd know better than to try and pull a stunt like this in my presence." The leader's smirk faltered, his confidence cracking under the weight of her words. But he quickly shook it off, doubling down on his bravado. "You think you can intimidate me?" he said, gesturing toward her with the pistol. "You're just a washed-up singer who thinks she's still important." The crowd gasped audibly, and even the scarred thug winced at the insult. But Dolly didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, her expression one of mild amusement. "Washed up," she echoed, her voice tinged with a hint of incredulity. "Bless your heart, honey. You don't have a clue who you're talking to, do you?" Before the leader could respond, the sound of a car door slamming outside drew everyone's attention. A new figure stepped into view, his silhouette briefly outlined against the flashing police lights. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark suit that seemed out of place amidst the chaos. As he entered the diner, the tension shifted, the weight of his presence drawing the attention of everyone in the room. "Who's that?" the scarred thug muttered, his eyes narrowing as he watched the man approach. The older officer's expression brightened slightly, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "Chief Benton," he said quietly. "Thank God." Chief Benton strode into the diner with the confidence of a man who had seen it all and wasn't impressed by much. His sharp blue eyes scanned the room, taking in the armed thugs, the terrified customers, and the steady composure of Dolly Parton standing near the counter. "What the hell's going on here?" Benton asked, his deep voice carrying easily over the noise. The leader sneered, raising his pistol slightly. "Stay back," he barked. "Don't come any closer or what?" Benton interrupted, his tone calm but laced with authority. He crossed his arms over his chest, his gaze steady as he stared the leader down. You gonna shoot me? In front of all these witnesses? With cameras rolling? The leader hesitated, his grip on the gun faltering slightly as Benton's words sank in. I'll do what I have to, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. No, you won't, Benton said, because you know as well as I do that pulling that trigger is the fastest way to ruin your life. You're already in deep, son. Don't make it worse. The leader opened his mouth to respond, but Dolly cut him off, her voice as smooth as honey. Listen to him, sugar, she said. The man's giving you an out. Take it while you still can. The brute shifted uncomfortably, his confidence clearly shaken. Boss, he muttered, his voice low, maybe we should. I said shut up, the leader snapped, his frustration boiling over. He turned the gun toward Benton again, his hand shaking visibly. I'm not going to jail for this. You don't have to, Benton said, his tone softening slightly. But if you keep waving that gun around, you won't leave us any choice. You want to walk out of here alive? Then put it down. No. The scarred thug took another step back, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender. I'm out, he muttered. This ain't worth it. The leader turned on him, his eyes blazing with fury. Coward, he spat. You're just gonna walk away? That's exactly what I'm gonna do, the scarred thug replied. You can keep playing tough guy if you want, but I'm not dying for this. Without another word, he bolted for the door, shoving past Benton as he disappeared into the night. The brute hesitated, glancing between the leader and the door, before finally throwing up his hands in exasperation. This is stupid, he muttered. You're on your own, boss. With that, he followed the scarred thug out the door, leaving the leader standing alone in the middle of the diner, his pistol still raised. The silence that followed was deafening. The leader's eyes darted around the room, his breathing ragged as he realized just how isolated he had become. The police officers, Benton, and Dolly all watched him intently, their expressions a mix of caution and resolve. It's over, Benton said, his voice steady. Put the gun down, son. But the leader wasn't ready to surrender. His grip on the pistol tightened, his eyes blazing with desperation. It's not over, he muttered, his voice shaking. It's never over. Dolly stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. It is if you want it to be, she said softly. The only person keeping this going is you. His grip on the pistol remained firm, but the sweat dripping down his forehead betrayed the chaos swirling in his mind. His two accomplices had abandoned him, fleeing into the night, leaving him to face the growing wall of opposition alone. Chief Benton stood tall, his arms crossed as he stared the man down. The weight of Benton's authority filled the room, his calm demeanor doing more to rattle the leader than the drawn weapons of the other officers. You're out of moves, Benton said firmly. Your boys are gone, and you're not walking out of here with that gun. You can end this the easy way, or you can make it worse. The leader's head snapped back toward Benton, his sneer cracking under the pressure. Shut up, he barked, his voice cracking. I'm not going anywhere. You think I'm scared of you? You think I care about your threats? Dolly, still standing her ground with unshakable composure, watched the leader with a sharp, calculating gaze. She could see the cracks forming, the desperation clawing at the edges of his bravado. But he wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. You're scared, Dolly said suddenly, her voice calm but cutting. I see it in your eyes. The leader spun toward her, his gun snapping up in her direction. You don't know anything about me, he spat, his hand trembling slightly. You don't know what I've been through. I know what I see, Dolly replied evenly. She didn't flinch, even with the barrel of the gun now pointed squarely at her. And what I see is a man who's scared out of his wits, trying to act tough to hide it. The tension in the room thickened, the crowd holding its collective breath as the leader's face contorted with anger and humiliation. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the terrified customers, the steady officers, and the unyielding presence of Dolly Parton. You don't get it, he growled, his voice low and venomous. You think you're better than me? You think you can just waltz in here with your perfect little life and judge me? Dolly raised an eyebrow, her expression softening slightly. I'm not judging you, sugar, she said. I'm just trying to understand why a man like you would throw his life away over something so small. Small? the leader repeated, his voice rising. You think this is small? You don't know what it's like out there. You don't know what it's like to have nothing. And you think this is going to fix that? Dolly asked, her voice firm but not unkind. You think scaring a bunch of innocent people is going to give you the life you want? The leader hesitated, his grip on the gun faltering slightly. But then his jaw tightened, and he shook his head violently. It doesn't matter, he muttered. None of it matters. I've already gone too far. No, you haven't, Dolly said gently. She took a small step forward, her hands still at her sides. You can still walk away from this. You can still make it right. Don't come any closer, the leader shouted, raising the gun higher. The sudden movement made several customers flinch, and one of the officers shifted his stance, his finger twitching near the trigger. Easy, Benton said sharply, holding up a hand to his men. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it, a warning that the situation could spiral out of control at any moment. Dolly stopped, holding her ground. I'm not going to hurt you, she said softly. I just want to talk. You don't get to talk to me, the leader snapped. You don't get to tell me what to do. None of you do. Mrs. Jean, who had been crouched behind the counter, suddenly spoke up, her voice trembling but clear. What do you want? She asked. Why are you doing this? The leader turned toward her, his eyes narrowing. What do I want? He repeated bitterly. I want what everyone else wants. A little respect. A little dignity. But no one gives that to guys like me. Respect? Dolly echoed, drawing his attention back to her. Honey, respect isn't something you take. It's something you earn. The leader's sneer returned, but it was weaker now, more forced. You think I care about earning your respect? He said. You think your opinion means anything to me? It should, Dolly said simply. Because I'm not the one pointing a gun at innocent people. I'm not the one who's going to walk out of here in handcuffs, if I'm lucky. Her words hit like a slap, and the leader flinched, his grip on the gun tightening as his breathing grew heavier. The cracks in his facade were widening, his bravado crumbling under the weight of her steady gaze. The sound of the diner door creaking open made everyone freeze. A new officer stepped inside, his face pale and his hand gripping his radio. He whispered something to Benton, who nodded grimly before turning back to the leader. Son, Benton said, his tone heavier now, we've got the building surrounded. There's no way out of here. If you want to walk out of this alive, you're going to have to work with us. The leader's eyes darted toward the windows, where the faint outlines of officers could be seen through the flashing lights. His breathing quickened, panic clawing at the edges of his mind. You're lying, he said weakly. You're trying to trick me. Look for yourself, Benton said, nodding toward the window. You're cornered, but it doesn't have to end badly. You can still make the right choice. The leader hesitated, his gun lowering slightly as he glanced toward the window. The desperation in his eyes was palpable, and for a moment, it seemed like he might surrender. But then his gaze snapped back to Dolly, his face twisting with anger. You think you've won, he said, his voice low and venomous. But I'm not done yet. The tension in the room spiked as he raised the gun again, his movements wild and erratic. The officers tensed, their fingers hovering over their triggers, but Dolly didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her eyes locked onto his, her expression calm but unyielding. You are done, she said firmly. You just don't know it yet. The room seemed to hold its breath as the leader's hand shook, his grip on the gun faltering once again. The leader's trembling hand still gripped the pistol, his eyes darting wildly around the room as the mounting pressure became too much to bear. His two accomplices had abandoned him, the police had him surrounded, and every pair of eyes in the diner was fixed on him, watching as his last shred of control unraveled. But Dolly hadn't moved. She remained as still and calm as ever, her piercing gaze never leaving the man holding the gun. The quiet strength in her posture seemed to fill the room, cutting through the tension like a warm light in the darkness. The leader, however, was still spiraling. I'm not going to jail, he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of his panic. You don't understand. None of you understand. Chief Benton, standing firm near the doorway, took a cautious step forward. His voice was low and steady, each word carefully chosen. You're right, he said. Maybe we don't understand. But pointing that gun at innocent people isn't going to help anyone understand you better. The leader whipped around, aiming the gun at Benton now. His face was twisted with desperation, his movements wild and erratic. "Stay back," he barked. "I'll do it. I swear I'll do it." The officers froze, their weapons still trained on the man. One of them whispered into a radio, the faint crackle barely audible over the deafening silence that filled the room. Outside, the flashing lights of the police cars painted the walls of the diner in a surreal red and blue glow. Dolly took a single step forward, drawing the leader's attention back to her. "You don't have to do this," she said softly, her voice calm but firm. "Nobody wants to see this end badly, not for you, not for Mrs. Jean, not for anyone." The leader sneered, though his bravado was cracking under the weight of her words. "What do you know about me?" he spat. "What do you know about what I've been through?" Dolly's expression softened, and for a moment, the steel in her gaze gave way to something warmer. "I know you're hurting," she said. "I can see it in your eyes. And I know you think this is the only way out. But it's not." The leader faltered, his grip on the gun loosening slightly. The room seemed to hold its breath, every eye watching as Dolly slowly took another step forward. "You've got a choice," she continued, her voice steady and unwavering. "Right here, right now. You can put that gun down, and we can talk about what you need. Or you can keep going down this road and lose everything." "I've already lost everything," the leader shouted, his voice breaking. His hand trembled visibly now, the gun wobbling in his grip as his composure crumbled. "No, you haven't," Dolly said. "Because you're still here. You're still breathing. And as long as you're breathing, there's a chance to turn things around." The leader's face twisted with conflicting emotions, anger, fear, regret. His eyes darted toward Mrs. Jean, who was still crouched behind the counter, her hands clutching the edge for support. Then he looked back at Dolly, her calm and steady presence like an anchor in the storm raging inside him. For a moment, it seemed like he might listen. His hand lowered slightly, the barrel of the gun dipping toward the floor. But then, as if realizing what he was doing, he snapped the gun back up, his face contorting with renewed fury. "Stop trying to play games with me," he snarled. "I'm not falling for your tricks." Dolly didn't flinch. "This isn't a game," she said. "This is your life we're talking about. And it's not too late to save it." The leader let out a bitter laugh, though there was no real humor in it. "Save it," he repeated. "What's left to save? I'm nothing. Nobody." "That's not true," Dolly said firmly. "You're somebody. Maybe you've lost your way, but you're not nothing. Nobody is." The leader hesitated, his hand shaking so violently now that the gun wobbled in the air. The crowd watched in tense silence, their breaths held as they waited to see what would happen next. And then, in a moment that no one could have anticipated, the brute who had fled earlier burst back into the diner, his face pale and his hands raised. "Boss," he shouted, his voice desperate. "It's over, man. Just give it up." The leader spun around, the gun now aimed at his former accomplice. "What the hell are you doing back here?" he demanded. "I told you to leave." "I couldn't," the brute replied, his voice trembling. "The cops are everywhere. There's no way out. Just listen to her, okay? She's right. You don't have to do this." The leader's face twisted with rage, and he took a step toward the brute, his grip on the gun tightening once again. But before he could say anything, Dolly's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Enough," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Put the gun down. Right now." The leader froze, his eyes wide as he turned back to face her. The room was deathly silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And then, finally, the leader's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him as his hand fell to his side. The gun slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor with a dull thud. The police moved in instantly, their weapons still drawn as they closed the distance. Benton stepped forward, his handcuffs at the ready, but it was clear the leader wasn't going to resist. He stood there, his head bowed, his body trembling as the weight of his choices finally caught up with him. Dolly exhaled softly, her shoulders relaxing as the tension in the room began to dissipate. The crowd started to stir, murmurs of relief rippling through the diner as people slowly emerged from their hiding places. But it wasn't over yet. Not entirely. Because as the police led the leader away, his head still hung low. Dolly's eyes followed him, her expression a mix of sadness and resolve. She knew this wasn't just about stopping a crime, it was about understanding the pain that had driven him to this point. And Dolly Parton wasn't the kind of woman to walk away without doing everything she could to make things right. The leader slumped in the back of the police cruiser, his head resting against the window as the flashing red and blue lights illuminated his hollow expression. The fight was gone from his eyes, replaced by a dull emptiness that seemed to weigh down his entire body. Outside, the growing crowd of onlookers gathered behind police barriers, whispering and pointing as his world unraveled. Chief Benton stood near the cruiser, speaking in low tones to the officers who had apprehended the man. His sharp eyes flicked toward the diner occasionally, ensuring everything was under control. Inside, Dolly remained at the counter, her calm demeanor unwavering despite the chaos that had unfolded. She watched as the remaining police officers began escorting the customers out of the diner, their murmurs of relief filling the air. Mrs. Jean, visibly shaken but unharmed, approached Dolly with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been here." Dolly smiled gently, placing a comforting hand on Mrs. Jean's shoulder. "You're stronger than you think," she said softly. "But I'm glad I could help." As the last of the customers filed out, the tension in the diner finally began to ease. The officers worked quickly to secure the scene, collecting the abandoned gun and taking statements from witnesses. Outside, the scene was anything but calm. News crews had arrived, their cameras rolling as they tried to piece together what had happened. The leader's face was now plastered across every live feed, his name whispered with disdain among the reporters. Inside the cruiser, the leader clenched his fists, his face burning with humiliation. He could hear the muffled voices of the reporters outside, their words slicing through the thin barrier of the car window. Arrested after a failed robbery attempt? Waved a gun at country music icon Dolly Parton? A shocking standoff that ended in surrender? Every word felt like a slap, each one hammering home the reality of his failure. He'd wanted respect, recognition, power, but now, all he had was the crushing weight of his disgrace. The brute, who had fled earlier but returned to surrender, was being questioned near the police barricades. His shoulders sagged as he answered the officers' questions, his face pale with regret. "I didn't know it would go this far," he muttered. "I thought we were just scaring her, you know? I didn't sign up for this." The scarred thug, however, was nowhere to be found. He had slipped away into the night, leaving his former accomplices to face the fallout alone. But his absence didn't matter. The cameras weren't interested in him. They were fixated on the man in the cruiser, the man who had thought he could take on the world and lost. Inside the diner, Dolly finally took a seat at the counter, her movements unhurried as she poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot Mrs. Jean had set down. The warmth of the coffee seemed to mirror the warmth that had returned to the room, the sense of safety slowly seeping back into the space. Chief Benton entered, his boots clicking against the tiled floor as he approached Dolly. "Well," he said, his voice gruff but tinged with respect, "that was one hell of a show." Dolly glanced up at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I just did what anyone would have done," she said. "Not anyone," Benton replied. "Most people would have been too scared to say a word, let alone stand up to a guy like that." Dolly shrugged, taking a sip of her coffee. "Fear's a funny thing," she said. "It only has power if you let it." Benton chuckled, shaking his head in admiration. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you've also got a way with words. I think you talked him down more than anything else." "It wasn't just me," Dolly said, her gaze drifting toward the door where Mrs. Jean stood. "Sometimes, people just need to be reminded that they're not alone. That there's a better way." Outside, the reporters had turned their attention to Benton as he exited the diner. Microphones were thrust toward him, the reporters shouting over each other in their eagerness to get a statement. "Chief Benton, can you tell us what happened? Was Dolly Parton in any danger during the standoff? Is it true the suspect surrendered because of her?" Benton held up a hand, silencing the crowd. "We're still gathering all the facts," he said, his voice steady. "But what I can tell you is that thanks to the courage and quick thinking of several individuals, including Ms. Parton, this situation ended peacefully. No one was hurt, and the suspect is now in custody." The reporters erupted into a flurry of questions, but Benton didn't answer. He turned and walked back toward the diner, leaving the media to speculate. Meanwhile, inside the cruiser, the leader sat in silence, his head bowed as he stared at his cuffed hands. The weight of his humiliation pressed down on him, the realization of how badly he'd failed sinking in deeper with each passing second. He had wanted to prove something, to himself, to the world, but all he had done was make a spectacle of his own downfall. As the cruiser began to pull away, the crowd outside parted to let it through. Some onlookers jeered, others simply shook their heads in disappointment. The leader refused to look up, his face burning with shame as the voices of the crowd followed him into the night. Back inside the diner, Mrs. Jean approached Dolly once more, her eyes glistening with tears. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "You saved my life. You saved this place." Dolly reached out, taking Mrs. Jean's hands in her own. "You don't need to thank me," she said softly. "This diner is more than just a building. It's a part of this community. And I'm not about to let anyone take that away." Mrs. Jean smiled through her tears, the warmth of Dolly's words filling her heart. "You're one of a kind," she said. "Don't ever change." Dolly smiled back, her eyes sparkling with quiet determination. "I don't plan to," she said. Outside, the reporters continued their frantic coverage, their voices blending into a cacophony of speculation and admiration. But inside the diner, peace had returned, a peace that had been hard-won and deeply cherished. The diner buzzed softly in the aftermath of the chaos, a quiet hum of relief and reflection. Mrs. Jean returned to cleaning the counter, her hands steady again, as customers began trickling back in. Outside, the flashing lights of the police cars faded into the distance, taking with them the man who had learned too late the price of his desperation. Dolly, still seated at the counter, watched the scene with a quiet smile. She had no interest in the reporters outside or the inevitable headlines. For her, the real victory wasn't in the cameras or the accolades. It was in Mrs. Jean's grateful smile, the whispered thank you from a teenage waitress, and the knowledge that she had helped turn fear into hope. As she stood to leave, she paused at the door, looking back at the small diner that felt more alive now than it had just hours earlier. "Take care of this place," she said to Mrs. Jean, her voice warm. "It's special." The moral of the story was clear. Even in the face of fear, kindness and courage can light the way. Dolly hadn't just defended a diner, she had defended what it stood for: community, strength, and the power of standing up for what's right.